Good day, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webcast. My name is Dio Kafense. I'm a content strategist with Globe Content Studio, which is the content marketing arm of the Globe and Mail, and I'm pleased to be your moderator today. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the Globe and Mail headquarters is located on the traditional territory of the Wendat and Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Métis Nation, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations. While we aren't anticipating too many technical issues, they could happen. That's part of how we're doing things these days. So we appreciate your patience should anything arise. Now, if you need technical assistance, please click on the help desk icon at the bottom of your screen and someone will be able to help you. Now, we're here to talk about the experiences of BIPOC women in the Canadian workforce, and there are lots of stories to tell. Today, we're going to hear from panelists that will give you perspective, both personal and professional, on what they're dealing with and how corporate Canada, can better support BIPOC women on their career journey. As you probably know, women typically experience a longer and more circuitous rise to the C-suite than men. I think we know that, but these challenges are significantly amplified for Black women, Indigenous women, and women of color. Today, we are going to talk about it with four fantastic women for our first section of the panel. And there will be some time for questions and answers from the audience. So please feel free to type it in. We do want to hear from you and get your perspective also. And then later on, we're going to hear from Marcy Ian, who's going to provide her perspective, not only as a media person in her former role, but also as a government minister, a cabinet minister in Canada. Also, you should know this discussion is part of the Globe Women's Collective, an initiative dedicated to sharing the perspectives of women in workplaces across Canada. I'm excited to introduce you to our speaker. Our first speaker is Paula Allen. She is with the global leader and senior vice president of research and client insights at TELUS Health. We are also joined by Angie Ng. She is the senior director of human resources, people and organizations at Novo Nordisk. We also have Andrea Gunrad. She is the VP of public engagement at the Canadian Women's Foundation. And we also have Martina Bachman-Huber. She is the Senior Manager of SOAR Development Program, which is a development program at Scotiabank. Thank you all for joining us today. First, I would like to start with Andrea. Andrea, at the Canadian Women's Foundation, you deal a lot with issues to deal with intersectionality and women. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience going through your career, not only at the Canadian Women's Foundation, but even maybe before you got there? What's your journey been like as a BIPOC woman trying to go through the corporate ladder?
Thanks for having me, Dio, and really glad to be here. This is a great question. I think I've been in some ways in a bubble because I've been in the nonprofit sector, and there's so many things that are positive about the nonprofit sector when it comes to reducing barriers and ending discrimination. That's an ethos that's very important. Whether or not that gets implemented fully is really, really dependent on things like funding and capacity and the kinds of kind of structural things that we're going to talk about today. And that's tougher. But I've had a good journey in the sense that I've had some great mentors and sponsors of women of color themselves who supported me all along the way and mentored me. And I think that that is a key element that kickstarts a career like mine. And being in here, I think that it's given me a good insight about what works and what doesn't work. So I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that as time goes on. But
Andrea,
honestly, yes, go ahead.
could you actually break that down a little bit? You said you
Yeah.
had some great sponsors and mentors. Can you distinguish between those two? I think those are terms we hear a lot, but we may not understand the distinctions and differences. And then if you can share a little bit about how a particular sponsor helped you.
Yeah, that question about a sponsor and a mentor, it's you'll see different definitions of it, but for me, a mentor is somebody who takes you on and spends time with you, coaching you to a degree, but a sponsor is somebody who really takes you on and puts their career at risk to bring you along all along the way. I see sponsorship as deeper. And I think that as much as it is important for the person being sponsored, it is also important for the sponsor themselves. It's a partnership between the two, and both get something out of it. Both get the experience of what it's like to support somebody and be supported. For me, In my career, I think about two racialized women in executive leadership roles who had both been my supervisors early in my career. They endorsed me, they coached me, they taught me, they encouraged me to tag along with them. They offered me unique opportunities 2 decades ago, long before the language of sponsorship I ever heard about in the zeitgeist. They facilitated my growth and my maturity, my development in immeasurable ways. And I can't envision that I would have gotten where I am today. I have to say though that I didn't earn the sponsorship. I see some people talking about sponsorship and saying that you have to earn it and it's difficult to assign. Mentorship maybe can be easier to assign. You work with this person, you work with this person, but sponsorship comes between the sponsor and the sponsee themselves, and it's a more organic relationship. I don't believe I earned it. I think my sponsors gave me the opportunity because they really just believed in giving that opportunity to a young woman in her early career in the nonprofit sector. And I'll
I
just give you
find
this. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, there's so much to talk about, so I don't want to be speaking over anyone. So apologies for that. But I find it interesting that you say that you don't think you earned it. And I feel sometimes that as women of color in this kind of corporate experience, that is either something that you are told that you didn't earn it, or that you kind of psychologically start to believe. Do you really think you didn't earn it?
Yeah, I do. And I'm saying that with all that understanding of the underselling that happens, the internalization that happens, the way that racism plays out in our lives. Sometimes it's racism and sexism and the nasty combination between the two. I'm saying that because I am so early in my career that I didn't necessarily have the proof points to say, hey, this person has earned 50%. I will give her a little bit more and she'll make it to 100%. I think there was a leap of faith that happened there. And that leap of faith was something that these sponsors took on. And I think the key for us to learn here is that we make organizations that make it easy for people to take leaps of faith and reward them. Then you have the perfect kind of conditions for sponsorship to happen. Let's not make it so that it's so rare.
My next question is going to go to Paula, but I want to actually ask you this too, Andrea, and then Paula, if you can pick it up. There is a discussion that we've had because I got the chance to speak to all of you last week just to kind of get a sense of what we might talk about today. And the topic that has come up a few times has been this idea of exceptionality, that when you're a BIPOC woman, when you are in these spaces, that you might be viewed as the exception and not the rule, and that can come with some pressure. Can you talk to me a little bit about how that you might have experienced that in your career or not?
Absolutely. I think in many ways I did early on in the career, again, felt that I had to represent somehow and represent myself and a whole cloud of people I didn't even know. There's something that I believe is very positive about that. I don't want to be entirely negative. I believe that it is positive to bring your community along with you, to speak to the underheard things. That's the role that you play. But where it becomes tokenizing, that's when it's undue pressure and disordinate for you and also harmful for your community because there's the diversity within your community that you also don't want to cloud over. So I had that experience. At the same time, too, I learned how to manage it from, again, great mentors who never let that get in their way and showed me and modeled it for me. How you do that right without putting yourself and having others put you in a tokenizing position.
So, Paula, I know when we spoke, you said that you were a Jamaican woman, a Jamaican child that moved to Canada, and that the experience of being a Caribbean household and this idea of exceptionality was something that you could really relate to. I remember when we talked, you were head nodding and had a lot to say. What's been your experience as you've had to deal with this idea of working in a Canadian context, but yet still growing up in a household that had some very different values?
Well, there's so many points that I could make around
Take
that
any
last
point.
question. So just in terms of the exceptionality, it's basically one of the points of damage that results when you don't have representation. So if you stand out in any way, people give you a little bit more attention, and it's not always positive attention. There is this sense that, there is something a little bit different about you. You're not really sure whether, you should be there or not. But there's also the tendency to internalize that, you have an opportunity. You are in a place where others would want to be, and you better not mess up. And think
Mm-hmm.
about that pressure. Like we have awareness now that in business, you have to be bold. You have to try, you have to brainstorm, you have to push limits in order to be successful. So you get that kind of message. At the same time, you get the message that if you slip up in any sort of way, then maybe it was a mistake for you to be where you are. Because again, if there isn't representation, it is exceptional.
Have you felt that yourself? Have you experienced that pressure yourself? And can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, I definitely experienced that. Experienced it most acutely when we first came to Canada, and actually mostly through my childhood. I was the only person of color in my school for a long period of time. So a lot of things, in terms of attention, I actually got it from home as well, with the best of intentions. My parents wanted to make sure that I stood out in a very positive way. So it was actually coached in me. And I think that shows itself in a number of different ways. You have to be strong, you have to be smart, you have to be the best, and you have to do it alone.
It sounds
And that
exhausting, Paula.
it's
And
you know
I
what?
say that because I know many friends, I know myself, I know in my family, this is not a one-off story, what you're saying. I don't know if corporate Canada necessarily understands this kind of pressure, and we'll talk more about it in the panel, that BIPOC women can feel around this idea of exceptionality. Now, some may say you're taking it on yourself, upon yourself, but what would you say to that?
Well, I think things come when you I think there are two parts to this.
Yeah.
I don't think people are taking on this sort of stress by yourself. I think it is absolutely true. I think with comments that are made, with things that happen on the side, there it does tend to be a harsher judgment. And let me put it into context. I'm not 100 years old. But I experienced this in my childhood. That's the way I grew up. The people who are my colleagues were also part of the same era and the same childhood. There are so many things that are in our culture right now that we might say, well, we're not doing that anymore. We know a little bit better. And we do know a little bit better. And we are trying a little bit more. But how do you reverse decades, centuries of attitude? It actually becomes part of you. It's really important for us not to say, well, this is a different time right now. We have to be intentional in correcting some of the misjudgments that we had in the past. The other point that I would add to it is that there is an element of this that requires us to be empathetic and understand different cultures. And there are many different Black cultures. I mean, it's hard to say a Black culture. There's Africa, there's the United States, there's the Caribbean, there's multiple diaspora, but there does seem to be some commonality in a couple of areas. One is stoicism. So when things are not going well, you show strength. You don't show weakness. You can push through. That is very, very, very strong in our culture. And it kind of leads to not necessarily asking for help because then you're showing weakness. So think about that as a cultural, reality on top of everything else that we just spoke about. The other part of it, which is probably more of the experience in a day-to-day basis of BIPOC women who are looking to advance, is that stoicism shows itself in not pushing yourself forward. It's a bit of humility as well. If you're doing a good job, you will get recognized. You work really hard and things move forward. If you do push yourself forward, it's seen as crass or overly abrupt, or you're putting somebody else in a difficult position. So
Mhm.
think about that growing up. Think about that and bringing it into the workplace, and think about the reality of how people advance in most corporate situations. You
And
advance by putting yourself forward. You advance by tooting your own horn, and that's contrary to what a lot of us bring to the table.
And the reality, too, is when you're trying to advance, it can be really terrifying. And Angie, when we were talking a little bit last week, you shared that in your journey as a career woman, usually one of few Asian women in career in leadership spaces, that to make that move was not an easy one. And you had to do some work to support yourself, which could also be a little isolating. At least that's what I took from what we talked about. But maybe you can share a little bit about your experience, Angie, maybe riffing off of what Paula said and sharing a little more about what you did to support yourself in your career journey as an Asian woman in the work world.
That is a great question. And I smiled when I listened to Paula because it's absolutely true. So I was always head of HR, but I became a member of the executive team very quickly, very suddenly. Within a few months in the role, I had a new leader, a new team, big learning curve, and then COVID hits. So a lot of uncertainty, a lot of things at the same time. And knowing I have a really big role, I needed to support our employees and their families and drive the business forward. So lots of things that I need to work on myself. I am a person who really do believe that I don't always have control of the external environment, and COVID is very much an example. So I do a lot of self work on myself. What does that mean? Using the Four Agreement as a really great book. So the Four Agreement by Don Louise really talk about I'm going to be my best advocate. How do I talk to myself to make sure that I don't beat myself up? I don't judge myself. When I'm facing situations where I'm afraid, I push myself forward. What do I do when I'm uncertain? I surround myself with people who really cares about me and my advocate. So these are things that I really make sure that I do the work, and it's constant, it's everyday work, that I can move myself to do things that are uncomfortable for me, that I can do things that I'm afraid, but I do it anyway.
But Angie, and I agree with you. I think what your approach and doing individual work works when someone has the supports
Mhm.
around them, whether it is they are individually an outgoing person or they know where to look for the support or they kind of have that in their mind. What's the responsibility of a corporation to provide that sort of foundation and scaffold for people to be able, and Black women and Indigenous women and people of color, to be able to rise in corporate? Is it really an individual's responsibility to create those opportunities or create those supports, or is it up to the organization?
I think it's a shared responsibility. And the really beautiful thing is a lot of organizations are doing that work. Really great work into really ensuring that we have psychological safe place, really embracing diversity, equity, inclusion. But our organization are at different maturity. And it is our responsibility to make sure we create our own psychological safe environment. We choose an organization that supports our growth and that we are our own best advocates. Because when we are able to do that, we bring our best authentic self to ourselves. And also, we are leaders in our organization, whatever your role is, and in the community that you serve. When you're able to do the combination of internal work and able to share it on an organization that also aligns with you, this is when the best fit happens.
Martina, I'm going to be asking you the question right after I take it to Andrea. You've been listening to what Paula and Angie have said. As a South Asian woman yourself, what is your take on what we've been discussing? Is it up to the individual to make a way for yourself? Culturally, how does that play out for you? And what's the role of an organization to support growth?
Well, I think I really agree with what everybody is saying here. And I do think that there's a dual responsibility that happens here. But I do think that the big power comes from structural changes within the organization, making the ground right so that people can do their individual growth and get the support that they need to get the steps forward. And I'm thinking particularly about three big shifts that need to happen, and that's at the leadership level, that there has to be a strategic business priority to make this a real priority. I see hiring and scaling up top leaders to be excellent at this effort and putting their performance metrics and compensation against it. I think it's a really good individual incentive when your own performance metrics are measured against how you're creating diverse leadership. And I think strong performance metrics for the organization itself that are publicly reported can be so powerful because, again, it's inviting external critique and push. And it's also saying, and this is what we're doing. And as Angie said, different organizations are at different levels of maturity here, but you can always get down on the stream of doing that. And individually, I do think that, yes, I can learn and take advantage of programs. And when that's set up so that it's welcoming and the environment is there for me to do it, I'm going to do it. So I see it as a structural piece, and then individuals come on and do their piece as well, too. But that structural is very important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Thank you
if I
for
could
that.
just add, just a
Please
comment
do.
on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I actually believe that this is important for several reasons, but one of those reasons is organizational risk management. So when you look at what's happening in the world right now, we have a very competitive business environment. We have a fast-moving environment. We know that organizations that have diverse talent and diverse leadership do better. That's one of the things that has been researched. We know that ESG, for example, is something that when organizations not only support the environment, but they support a socially healthy workplace, a diverse workplace, they have diversity, equity, and inclusion built into their culture, they do better. So you can say, well, who should take the responsibility? There is joint responsibility, but I think the organization needs to say, well, do I want to make sure that I get the best out of the people that I have, each and every individual, that they can bring their own skills to the table in a fulsome way, so that I can be successful in terms of representing the broader general population, so I can make good business decisions? Or do I want to lose that talent? So you're going to lose it in one way or another. Either people will stay with you and they will be under
Or they'll move
optimized, or
on.
they'll leave. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to bring in Martina because you provide a really interesting perspective on a couple of fronts on this topic. You are an Indigenous woman, and you are also the senior manager of a development program at Scotiabank that's working on the pipeline to bring in the supports that we're talking about. So you're not that you are on the organizational side, but you are representing an organization that's doing some of this corporate work to provide some supports for BIPOC women. Can you speak a little bit about why you think that's important?
Okay, yeah. I'll speak as an Indigenous woman and a person who is, developing young talent. A lot of the time in Indigenous communities, Indigenous youth are the fastest growing youth in Canada. And we need to create, and I love what everybody has been saying here, we need to create those safe spaces and that structure, what you were saying, Andrea, there. And it starts with those youth. It starts directly with those youth. So when I look at, creating these programs and, looking at what the youth may want, it is creating that framework to start with. And how can we replicate that framework throughout as we move out up the leadership levels? And I'll talk a little bit about that, what I mean. So when I develop this, the first question I always ask is my program source specifically creating a safe space for my candidates? And a safe space could look differently for, each and every individual. It could take into questions that do they want a cultural side to be reflected in those in that safe space? Do they want to just be acknowledged that they're Indigenous? Do they want their voices heard? And then I'll communicate that and what that might look like for each and every individual to our leaders. So whether that be, what does performance look like? Indigenous peoples are always asked to, guide and develop these structures and organizations and lead these initiatives. But they can, and I do believe it's very, very important to lead those voices. and have Indigenous people lead that. However, it doesn't mean that an Indigenous person is going to take on all the additional initiatives within those structures. So I think from starting there, I think it's a really good part from like a campus perspective to really build off of that and use that framework with our youth and develop it as we move forward.
Martina, can we talk a little bit about what I have a few points I'd like to touch on, but let's talk about the business of who does this work. And I want to bring in other voices here too. Often in these conversations, when it comes to BIPOC women and work, typically it feels like sometimes it's BIPOC women who have to clean up, teach, showcase, lead. And is that necessarily fair, just, or right? A heavy question, I know. I'll have you start and answer that, and perhaps I'll throw it to Andrea to also offer perspective.
Okay. I feel that is a loaded question.
I didn't mean for it to be. There's a lot there, I know.
There's a lot of ways to answer it. I think, reflecting that Indigenous voice specifically, you need it there. And I'm going to say that it should be coming from different Indigenous peoples. Like I'm from Wabigoon Lake Ojibwe First Nation. That's a First Nation. But when we group Indigenous peoples, their voices of the Métis peoples, Inuit peoples. So I'm making sure that even if these Indigenous peoples come together to create those spaces, we're making sure that we incorporate all of the Indigenous peoples and all of their voices. And I think that's fair. What I don't think could be again, it's a double-edged sword. On the other side of that, it's not fair to make Indigenous people lead all of their initiatives. And what I mean by that is the whole piece around reconciliation. Reconciliation does not begin or advance if we don't have our leaders standing up or taking on those initiatives to learn the history of Indigenous people, or to develop the frameworks in mind with an Indigenous lens. And I think there's a lot you can do on that reconciliation piece, which I think will actually grow your organizations more. It helps your leaders understand these diverse and unique communities. So I think in order to hit that reconciliation piece, we should see more of, our leaders or colleagues taking on that work and making sure still those voices are captured there. So I'll stop there. I know you want to grab some other opinions on that.
No, I would love to hear what Andrea feels, and then I'm going to go to Angie after, because sometimes when you are trying to do this work in teaching, it can sometimes feel a little unsafe or unstable depending on the strength of an organization. You're kind of putting yourself out there. Andrea, what's your view on what we've been discussing when it comes to who should take on this work? And I think we talked a little bit about it, but if you could also speak a little bit about psychological safety, which is something that has been coming up a lot lately in business.
We see the research that says that women of color in particular tend to feel inordinate responsibility for leading these things. And sometimes they're specifically hired in D&I roles and not in other leadership roles. So you see that bind there where, yes, there's a lot of energy and interest in this area from racialized women. At the same time, too, it feels like a real heavy pressure. And I think where it becomes so problematic is when it is not shared across the organization, where it's not a leadership all the way through the organization, right down to your strategic priorities and your plans for the next 5 years. And you're struggling sometimes with even costs to be able to make this happen. That's when it becomes, I think, so problematic. I appreciated, Martina, what you said, because I think there's that dynamic where if it is a whole organization move and responsibility, everybody's involved in some way. And it is not for people of color, women of color to end sexism, end racism, and all the other isms. It's not up to us to do that. It's for the organization to do that and see us as partners, as supports for that, but not put us in a place that makes it more difficult and more unsafe, as you're saying, especially what Paula said. Really important for us to remember this, because we know that exceptionalism, that tokenism happens, and sometimes we might be pushed into that and absolutely burn out and absolutely take a hit in our own careers.
Actually, I want to just jump on that and actually move to Angie, because when we were speaking, Angie, I really appreciated that you took a moment to share the real fear that you had when you were going into your role in leadership at some stage in your journey. And I would like to understand more, just so that others can appreciate on this panel and those watching what the real terror can be like when you are walking into these spaces. While people celebrate BIPOC women in corporate as people continue to move, it can sometimes be a lonely place and it can also be a scary place. And Angie, I appreciated you shared that with me. Can you share a little bit more about your experience to perhaps help others appreciate what people are going through?
Absolutely. I grew up in an Asian household. I'm Asian, of course. And when I first came to Canada, there were very few Asians, and being visibly different, um, and growing up in a household where you don't really want to speak up. You just want to assimilate. You don't want to be different. You don't want to stand out. And that between the two of them, not being visible and being Asian, it's not easy. So there's a lot of push that I had to work on myself to believe that I can do it. That goes back to the self work that I referenced. I do also want to speak about Andrea's point that she mentioned earlier. In our organization, we ground or anchor our diversity, equity, inclusion strategy on something called GDEIB, which is based on all parts of the organization in terms of strategies and things. So I don't believe that is one focus. I believe it's organizational wide, strategy wide. And also, in order for us not to be separated, we need to bring everyone together. And our diversity, equity, inclusion team, they include a lot of different background ethnic groups because we all have a role in this.
So, what do you think organizations, leaders, perhaps men, perhaps people who aren't BIPOC women, as we all are, need to know or appreciate about our experiences in order to make better organizations? And I'll ask that question to as many as I can before we go to the audience. I'll start with you, Angie, and then go to Martina. What do you think organizations need to know to improve so that BIPOC women can continue to succeed?
I think it starts with knowing, sharing that experience so that they can understand how it feels like. That's the first step.
Okay, Martina, what's your view?
Yeah, I have a few on this. So the first thing, I'm going to agree with Angie. It's that educational piece, especially when coming to Indigenous peoples. They really need to. You really need to understand the history, and I don't mean when European contact happened. Even prior to that, Indigenous traditions, protocols, and the way they worked with each other is so beautiful. And so I think that educational piece is really, really important. And, just a side bit of that, I'm an Indigenous person and I didn't grow up in community. My grandmother was that residential school survivor. So I am, as many others are still even learning my own history. So I'm involved in that educational piece. Next, I think, I would love to see, again, touching on that framework we all touched back to, is that enterprise-wide framework, for Indigenous peoples. It either can be, in the Indigenous world, that Truth and Reconciliation Action Plan, or the learning leadership development programs we see. And then kind of building off that, I think, once we have established those frameworks in place, we need to update them consistently. A lot of the time I see these frameworks are in place, and, as my journey and healing begins, as others evolve in their careers, a lot of the time those frameworks are stagnant. And it would be wonderful to, continuously change them for everybody's values as they constantly shift. And that also means, sometimes in the back of my head, I'm hearing that word capacity. We might not have capacity, hiring freezes. So if that happens, I challenge leaders then. I challenge leaders to take that framework that's already in place. And when you're having those career discussions, to work with your colleagues, your employees, and understand by listening, getting feedback of how those aligns with their current values. So I'll stop there. And those are three really important points to me.
Those are great points, Martina. Thank you. And actually, my producer, Andrea, thank you, Andrea, has texted me some questions from the audience. So I'm just going to ask one, and I'll ask Paula to answer this one, or try to. One of the questions is, how should a BIPOC woman go about finding a BIPOC mentor if she doesn't have someone to look to within her workplace? That's an audience question for you. Paula, what do you say to that?
Yeah, I don't think you need to have your mentor only being in your workplace. You can have a mentor that's outside of your workplace. You could have a mentor that's even outside of your industry. So it's really someone who has experience in terms of navigating through the corporate world, but more important, someone who is going to be able to help you shine in terms of your strengths. It's very interesting that sometimes people believe that mentorship or help is pointing out everything that you're doing wrong. Well, that kind of is a little bit soul sucking at a certain point. But if somebody truly believes that you have potential, they're going to focus on that potential. They're going to want to make sure that you're focusing on that potential and you're showing it. So I wouldn't say limit yourself only to your organization. Really just choose the right person who is going to help you shine.
Without getting anyone's age, because I won't ask anyone's age, but I think we can go back 20 years for everybody. I don't know if we can go back 30 years for everybody, but I think we can go back 20 years to 2003. The question that has come is, what career advice would you give to a younger version of yourself? So if we were to be talking in May 2003, 20 years ago, Andrea, who would I have met? And what advice would you be giving to yourself then that you know now?
Oh, that's such a good question. I would say I would tell myself, listen to yourself. When you feel something feels odd, believe that it is off at least, and go ask somebody who may have a little bit more wisdom than you what you can do. Seek that advice proactively. Don't wait for people to come to you. They don't always come to you, but you have got some good people in your life that you can reach out to.
It is sometimes hard, I know from experience as a Black woman in my case, to be going up to people and asking for advice. Now, it's kind of easy for me because I'm pretty extroverted, but for some people, it's not easy. So, how would you get them to get through that hump, or how would you get yourself through that hump if I was talking to Andrea circa 2003?
Would say that there is a two or three people maybe that she knows, this Andrea, who maybe she trusts a little bit more than other people. And those are the people who perhaps have shown themselves to be trustworthy in other tricky situations. And start there and let that feel like a process that's easy, achievable, and then start circling out from there. I was also a bit extroverted myself, so it's easy for me. I hear you, but if you can find one trusted voice in your life and you go from there, it's really good. It doesn't have to be somebody who you work with, as Paula wisely said.
I will ask the same question to Angie. 2003, if I had met you, what were you up to, and what advice would you have given yourself then that you know now?
I would tell myself, I am enough. Keep trying. Surround myself with really great people who will tell me authentically what I need to hear.
Did
And
you ever question whether you were enough, Angie?
I think absolutely. When I was younger, I didn't think I would be where I am now. Absolutely.
I think the person I'm meeting now, I would have expected you to be where you are now, but I don't know who Angie was 20 years ago.
Angie was very shy. So I can tell everybody, you can do it. Trust yourself.
Actually, I'll ask the same question to Martina. It's again an audience question. What career advice would you give to your younger self? a younger version of yourself. I think I can go back 20 years with you, Martina. I didn't know if I could go back 30, but I think I can go back 20.
You could go back 30, but I'd be really a baby. But so the career advice I would give myself back then is, I don't think I would change it. I really knew who I was. I am one person that's like, go with it, whatever you love, you can do it. So I was like that from a young age. I think, more along the career advice is knowing when my emotions come up. I used during my career, I like to get stubborn a little bit. I will admit, I took things a little too personally, and I involved a lot of my personal life into my work, especially in this space as being an Indigenous woman. So I think just letting me know that it's okay. Disconnect sometimes, and it's not always easy, but disconnect and learn to get those tools that you need to balance that work life and that professional life is what I would give.
In hosting a few of these webinars and live discussions over the past year or so with the Globe events, I have really noted that there seems to be a bit of a shift in understanding, particularly from women who may not be BIPOC women or people who may not be BIPOC people, to try to be allies in this journey that BIPOC women that we go through. So one of the other questions that's come from the audience is, what does allyship for BIPOC women at work look like? And I'm going to ask Paula to take that one, considering that we don't know who asked or what they mean by it, but just through the words, what does allyship for BIPOC women look like from your perspective, Paula?
I think the first step in any allyship is really empathy, respect, listening, helping yourself understand the other person's perspective. I don't think that you can do anything positive unless you understand. So I think absolutely that's the first step. And allies all have roles. It could be a leadership role, it could be a non-leadership role, a coworker role. I think the next step is, what within your role, what within your power can you do to make things different? So one of the things that we do know is that there's some research that says that the experience of BIPOC individuals, and in particular BIPOC women, is different than those who are not. And it's not different in a major way. It's just ongoing experiences that you have in the workplace. It's being interrupted a little bit more. It's not being heard in the same way. Attribution of your ideas elsewhere. All of these things.
I know that one well. Yep.
Yeah. So all of these things wear on an individual, and all of these things wear on an individual in terms of their own self-esteem and their own self-worth. But it also wears on them in terms of how others view them. So I think one of the things that's very, very helpful is, recognizing that this happens, paying attention when it does, and really standing up, really kind of challenging when these microaggressions do happen, and making sure that the other person feels supported, because if you don't feel supported, you actually create an impression of yourself that is not accurate.
It sounds like
So
you're speaking
again,
from experience, Paula, and I feel like there's a story there that you can share about how this has happened to you.
oh yeah, I don't think that it's an unfamiliar situation for anyone. And you look at your question before about what you would do a little bit different. It did wear on me. At a certain point, I know I have a certain intelligence, I know I have a certain drive or whatever. And then I was like, why is it that I'm not feeling confident? So it does wear on you. And one of the things that I would say, it's the flip side of exceptionality. You said it's a burden. You said it's exhausting. The examples that I gave you kind of contribute to that. But you develop a really keen eye. You would develop a really keen understanding about what's going on around you. You have empathy. You put yourself in the other person's place a lot. It just happens that you have to be more attentive when you have that exceptional experience, just to make sure that you can get through a day. And what I realized is that I had an assumption that if I see something going wrong, a decision that's not right, or a path with some roadblocks in it, or if I'm picking up from a client or the marketplace, a feeling that we need to attend to, I always assume, well, somebody else must have that assumption as well. They must know, like it's pretty obvious.
Mm-mm.
And what I realized
Because
is that it is not, and that I
we
needed to
see
speak up.
things
Yeah,
differently. We just do. I know
exactly.
for myself, when I'm in certain
Yeah.
spaces, I will reach out to younger people of color because I can appreciate what that journey is
Hmm.
in ways that, not to suggest that others don't get it, but they get it maybe a little differently than BIPOC women would understand it. So to suggest that everyone sees everything in the same way is not true.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And it's important to remember that the way that BIPOC women see things in corporate Canada is an important perspective that needs to be part of the conversation and part of the change that we need to see happen in corporations. And I just want to I think we have maybe time for a few more comments. Andrea, is there anything that you want to add before we close?
I would say that, I appreciate what everybody said here. And I love that point that when we have a perspective that's underrepresented in a corporation, that's a problem for the corporation's well-being, bottom line, efficiency, exactly what everybody has been saying here today. So it's not a charity case, it's a case of good business or bad business. And that's what we have to take it forward with. Otherwise, we are losing out and we are hurting ourselves.
That
And
matter of
if
being
I
a
could just add at one thing, I think the point is that, this is a journey and it needs intentionality. And there's some organizations that are working very, very hard and have cultures that are very, very positive and inclusive. It does not mean that they still don't have to be intentional. We have a society where, we have a lot of inequity. And we have to make sure that in the places that we control and influence, that we are working against that.
Well, I just want to thank everyone on this panel for bringing such openness, such perspective, such important stories that corporate Canada needs to hear, understand, take in, and activate on to make the changes that we need to see to provide the psychological safety that we need to feel as BIPOC women in different organizations across Canada. So Martina, Angie, Paula, and Andrea, thank you so much for joining us today. I just want to thank you on behalf of the Globe and Mail for your time and your stories and your vulnerability too in sharing what aren't always easy stories, but we hope you also agree they're important stories for us to better move the needle on this issue. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. I am now going to introduce the second half of our conversation, and this will be with the Honorable Marcy Ian. She's a member of Parliament and the Minister for Women and Gender Equality in Youth. She's also an award-winning journalist, author, and I've actually gotten to know Marcy a little bit because our media paths have crossed a few times. We haven't worked in the same place necessarily, but we certainly have seen each other out and about in the Toronto area. And it's a pleasure to speak to you today, Marcy. Thank you for joining us.
So happy to be with you. I've been listening in to the panel conversation. It's fascinating. Thanks for being so honest and true. My gosh, how refreshing is that?
Was there anything in particular that jumped out at you? And if not, I could actually give you some perspective. We talked a lot about exceptionality, which I know from our conversations just out and about, and also from your book, this business of having to be great, this pressure to always be on script, the leaving little room for error, and often being one of few in a room. How do you wear that? How did you wear that?
Mm. So it's been 30 years or so. It was about 30 years or so in the industry, in the broadcast industry. And I guess, Daya, you're talking about Canada AM.
Mm-hmm.
And Canada AM, when I was put in that position, first as a news anchor, but then as a co-host, I became an only. And what that meant was the first Black woman to co-host a national morning show. And this is not pressures that anybody said, hey, you need to perform or you're out the door. These are pressures that we face as women of color, as people of color, and that we put on ourselves. It was me saying, listen, it's important that I'm not an only. It's about who's coming next. And for me, it's always about who's next. It's about, yes, the job at hand, but who's watching, who can see themselves because I'm there. And how do I make sure that they realize all of those goals? And to me, that meant being excellent. It meant being better researched. It meant being prepared for every interview that I did. And that doesn't mean that I was perfect. I was far from. But that pressure. And another first that I've talked a lot with and is a good friend of mine is Kayla Gray. And Kayla said something to me several years ago that I've never forgotten. And that's, Marcy, when you're in spaces like that, it means you're taking a whole community with you. You're walking through that door, but you're taking a community with you. And that is an honor, but that's a responsibility as well.
It's an honor and responsibility. I just was out to lunch with her a few weeks ago, so I know Kayla well too. And certainly people who are in these roles have this pressure, but it's also exciting to be in a role like that too. And in your role too, now as a cabinet minister, are there similar pressures?
It's not pressure, it's responsibility. It's that responsibility part. So I ran a couple of years ago because George Floyd was killed. And I was sitting and loving being part of a talk show, but asking myself at the age of 50, what do I need to do here? How can I serve better? And so now that I'm in this position, I realized quickly that I'm a kind of different voice at the table.
Yeah.
I'm a daughter of immigrants who landed in St. Jamestown in the 60s. And then, my dad got a job in Scarborough, and that's where I was raised. My lens is very, very different from most of the people that I share a cabinet table with. And yes, go ahead, Dad.
It's an important, as we were talking about in the panel previous, it's a different voice, but it's an important voice that has often been missing in these conversations that needs to be amplified, arguably, to represent people that will not be at that table necessarily.
I take Toronto Centre everywhere with me. And that means every conversation that I have, I'm talking about Regent Park and Moss Park and Cabbagetown and the Village and Corktown and St. I take all of my riding with me into every conversation because quite frankly, I think it represents the country. It's like it's the smallest riding, but it represents a lot of people who don't often get a voice. And I'm their voice and honored to be their voice.
So when you're across the country, because you get the opportunity to go across and up and down Canada, and you're talking to other BIPOC women, what are the stories you're hearing? And in particular, when we're looking at the pandemic, you mentioned that you ran in part because of George Floyd, which was happening in the context of a pandemic. And we know that BIPOC women were impacted a lot during the pandemic. What are some of the stories that you've heard, the good and the bad, that corporate Canada, the people listening, people who are in areas that can make change, what do they need to know from some of the stories you're hearing?
There's so many lessons to be learned, but first and foremost, the unsiloing, as I like to call it. There's so many women working the front lines through the pandemic, and we know this. And there's so many orgs that were kind of working in silos, whether it was for their various communities. And what we saw was an opportunity for those orgs and a lot of those people to come together in ways that were never possible before. So, for example, if you're providing food for somebody that needs it, and somebody down the road has a restaurant and they've got extra food right now, Well, maybe those two orgs come together, and that's what's happening across this country. And not only just during the pandemic, but it's created relationships that continue to move forward. Mental health. And can I say that about 15, 20 times?
Oh, it needs to be repeated.
Oh my gosh, right across the board. And also, you know, for people of color, those are different stakes. A lot of us, because we carry so many things and we have these conversations with ourselves, and I'm raising my hand,
Expectations.
Expectations. And this is pre-pandemic. So you add a pandemic to that kind of that we carry, and that the whole idea that we have to be resilient and persevere and all of these things, and mental health is off the charts, and that is across the board. But here's the other thing that I've learned is that not all mental health treatments are created the same, and not all communities see mental health the same way. So my background is West Indian, and I've spoken about this a lot, where I have immigrant parents, and it was about work. We're here, we came here with nothing, and we are here so that you have a better life, you and your sister. So you roll up your sleeves, and please don't talk to us about not feeling well or feeling blue.
Yeah.
You know, we felt a lot too, and we just kept it moving.
Get out there in that snow and go to school. Get out there and get those grades. Fine. If you don't come with A's, don't come. Oh,
right.
I had Barbadian parents. I know exactly what you're saying.
Right. But here we are, and we're at a time where we need to talk about mental health. We need to validate what is needed, especially, you know, for women of color. We need to understand what is needed, and that needs to be appropriate care as well, because not all care is created equal. So to have those conversations within our families and be comfortable to have them, and within our friend groups, and be brave enough to step up and say, I need some help. And to have help available that is culturally appropriate. I remember visiting an Indigenous Friendship Center. I'm so sorry in Halifax.
Oh, not at all. Go ahead.
And it was all about culturally appropriate help, meaning elders were involved, meaning community was involved, meaning women felt empowered to go there. I'm just back from Yellowknife, same thing. I was at a wellness center in Yellowknife where elders are laying hands, they're practicing different things, they are getting back to the earth. There is a Dene culture that has a law that is abided by, and people are coming forward because they feel comfortable and they're receiving help in different ways. Sorry, go right ahead.
The undercurrent of the conversation that I had with the other women and what you're saying here is mental health is important, but not always talked about. And it's also particularly important for BIPOC women who carry a lot coming into the workspace.
So much.
Whether you're seeing it or not. And leaders who are in spaces that can make change probably need to account for that or consider that more. Would that be about what you're suggesting as well?
Absolutely. And also, who are those leaders? It was 30 years in broadcast, and I never had a person of color lead me. I had many women and white women, but never an executive that was Black or Indigenous. These are newsrooms that we're talking about here across this country that is representative of the people and the populations within this country. So people need to see themselves as well. We need to understand that we're working within systems, and those systems need to change and need to be called out.
We have about 5 more minutes if you can stay with us.
How do we have 5 minutes?
Oh because you came in a little late.
I'm so sorry.
No, it's great though. I'm glad we can extend for 5 minutes. I'm just letting the audience know we had to stop at 1:30, but if we can stay for 5 more minutes, I have a couple more questions. One is about allyship. The discussion about allyship was a question that came from our audience panel, our audience watching the panel, asking, what does allyship look like? You mentioned that you were in a newsroom for X amount of years with white women leaders mainly. You mentioned that you were the only and often an exception, and you're not alone in that. Many people in media, myself included, in certain areas and career stops, was one of few often, not necessarily only, but definitely one of few. What does effective allyship look like then from your perspective, what advice would you offer those who are watching, whether they are on the leadership track or anywhere on their career path, just entry level? What does allyship look like?
Well, first and foremost, I don't know that you can teach empathy, and allyship and empathy go hand in hand. I don't know. I mean, you can model what it looks like, but I'm not sure that you can teach it. And I say that because that, Dio, is a question that I'm asked, or used to be asked a lot. Marcy, tell us what we need to do. Show us what we need to do. And I would say, listen, I'm a Black woman. You know what you need to do. We're talking about a system here. So act in a way that is appropriate. Make sure that diversity and inclusion are just not words we banty about. Inclusion is a real thing. I mean, diversity is something that we have. Inclusion means you're hiring in an inclusive way. It means you're mentoring in an inclusive way. It means you're calling things out. And it means sometimes for women of color who may not want to speak up, who may not want to raise their hand because they're not as crusty as I am. And I'm at a point where it's like, I'm raising my hand.
I don't know
say
if you're
whatever.
crusty. I would not call you crusty.
A little
I
bit.
would not.
A little bit.
Okay.
Right. But for younger people coming in, it means somebody seeing them and seeing the potential and leading them and being there for them and saying to them, hey, if you want to grab some tea, because I was with you in that meeting and maybe you didn't use your voice in a way that you wanted to or felt comfortable to, but I'm here for you and I'm here to show you, and maybe amplifying that voice to others. It really is for people in power to change, and not really for us to instruct them how to do that because they know what to do. It's about grabbing hold, and allyship means leadership as well. It means serious leadership.
Yeah. And as our last question, you are now in a very powerful position. You always had a sense of platform, whether it was on the social or CTV, but now as Minister for Women and Gender Equality and Youth, you have a role to play yourself in terms of what you can do to make shifts and change. So what does Canada need to focus on for BIPOC women to have a fair chance at success?
You can't know where you're going or create policy if you don't know in numbers what the country looks like. So disaggregated data is something that my ministry, our team calls for a lot and works with a lot. So, for example, a huge part of the 2S LGBTQI plus action plan that we have, it's a $100 million plan. There's a chunk of it that is dedicated to getting data because we need to know who our neighbors are, who's here. The chief statistician hears from me a lot. And what he has shared is that right now, our country has 21% racialized folk in it. 21%. In 20 years, that'll double.
Right.
So the question is, who are we creating policy for? How are we looking at those numbers and making sure that we are speaking to and creating policy for the Canada of now and the Canada in 20 years? A lot of our youth policies, things around youth. The first question I asked was, what constitutes youth? And I was told 15 to 29. And I said, with all due respect, my kids are being lost to the streets at 11. So we need to look at it. So now we are piloting projects that start during middle school. Things like the Canada Serve at 12 instead of 15.
Right. And that early start makes a difference, right?
Huge difference. Huge difference in mentorship and doing things before kids get weapons in their hands. Understanding that it's not about reactive processes, but it's about proactive and community.
Right. Well, I want to thank you for spending time with us and sharing a little more about your perspective, both personal and professional, both media and politics, about what can be done to shift the needle for BIPOC women. Thank you so much, Marcy. So good to see you.
So happy to see you. See you soon. And to the other others on the panel. You're amazing, just excellent. So keep doing all the work that you're doing. I'll see you soon.
Thanks, Marcy. And with that, I want to just thank the audience that's been watching today's webcast and for sharing your questions. We will be sharing a link to the recorded webcast in about a week, so you can look out for that. I hope it's been pleasurable for you and you've learned a lot. Thank you again and enjoy your day.